Hi there, everybody. I'm Jeff Maris from WisPolitics.com and WisBusiness.com. Here today with a special virtual luncheon on how federally funded research fuels the Wisconsin economy. There's a lot of money that comes from the federal government, and there could be even more if Congress acts on certain measures. We're going to have a discussion today with researchers but first, I want to thank all the event partners: Marquette University, University of Wisconsin-Madison, University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee, the Medical College of Wisconsin, and the Wisconsin Technology Council. And we're going to begin today with some words from Tom Still. He's the president of the Wisconsin Technology Council, and that helps join the public and private sectors in promoting research, development, and technology in Wisconsin. Welcome, Tom.
Well, thank you, Jeff, to you, WisPolitics, WisBusiness, and your team. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about the role of the Tech Council and, how much money comes into the state from the feds and, how that helps the state economy.
Sure. The Tech Council, we're in our 20th year now, and we have done a lot to work with different facets of the early stage economy and later stage as well in Wisconsin. Researchers, investors, entrepreneurs, young companies, mature companies that need new ideas, new tech. And so that's one of the roles that we play. There's a policy side to what we do as well. We try to make sure that members of the legislature and our congressional delegation are well aware of what's going on in Wisconsin's tech economy and why it's so important to support it. So in terms of what's going on in federal research dollars in Wisconsin, there's 1.5 billion plus a year that is invested in Wisconsin research institutions, academic research institutions, basically led by the four that are represented here today. So it's Madison, it's Medical College of Wisconsin, UW-Milwaukee, Marquette, but other institutions such as MSOE and the different WISIS campuses around the state, the other comprehensive campuses that are increasingly doing more research. And it's in areas that really cover a wide variety of topics, everything from computing to all types of health-related research, sustainability, which is big in Wisconsin with energy and water, advanced manufacturing, cybersecurity, extreme materials and advanced materials. Those are all some of the kinds of things that these institutions and others are working on. What does it do beyond the direct spending? Well, of course, that helps support the work of researchers and others in all of these institutions. But also there's a lot of indirect spending. All of these institutions buy things. They have space, they have contractors, they have others who work with them. And so the money goes far beyond those institutions. Then it's also important in terms of working with industry in Wisconsin and beyond, and with startup companies. There's a lot of literature nationally about how startup companies, usually there's a high percentage that are within 50 miles of a research institution. So that watershed is not only right at the institution itself, but in the area beyond. So that's really important. So coming up, some important federal opportunities. The Endless Frontier Act has morphed into a couple of other bills in Congress. At the Tech Council, we're doing some things to help facilitate discussions around that. But that could be the biggest burst of federal investment in R&D, really in more than a generation.
Yeah, now we did a program on that in DC that you were also supporting. WisPolitics and WisBusiness did something in DC earlier this month, in fact, on that. And we had one of the sponsors of the Endless Frontier Act, Representative Mike Gallagher, a Republican from Green Bay, who was there. And then we had some researchers like we're going to have here today talking about it.
Yeah.
You can see that video and the recording of that at WisPolitics.com, by the way.
Indeed. And I urge everybody to do so. Mike Gallagher has been really strong on this, and it's a bipartisan effort. It's morphed into some other bills at this point, and so we don't know exactly what's going to come out of it. But across the board, the emphasis is the same: increased R&D. And so Wisconsin will have a chance to compete for these dollars. But it'll require a couple of things that are often pretty hard. Number one, bragging about ourselves. And number two, collaborating. And that's going to have to happen across, I think, all of these kinds of institutions for the right proposal to be put together and to make sure that it differentiates Wisconsin from other states that will be competing as well. So this is very timely, Jeff. Thank you for putting this together. And it's going to be an important step towards where we need to go as a state.
Okay. Well, thanks, Tom, for giving us an overview, and thanks for your support of these kind of programs and your support of research in Wisconsin. So let's go to the panel now, and we're going to go to a panel of people from the major research institutions in the state who do research into problems that affect all of us, and in their way are helping the economy. So I want to introduce the panel. Jeanne Hossenlopp. She's Marquette University's Vice President for Research and Innovation. She is a professor of chemistry and served as Vice Provost for Research as a graduate school dean from 2010 to 2015. We also have Sandra McLellan. She's a professor in the School of Freshwater Sciences at UW-Milwaukee. Her research focuses on the connections between environmental processes and human health. Then we have Katarina Marie Braun, a UW-Madison medical student who has a PhD in cellular and molecular biology and has done extensive research work on flu and COVID viruses. So we all know that that's timely, right? And important. And Dr. Shekar Kurpad of the Medical College of Wisconsin. He has done extensive research in spinal cord injury and is internationally recognized in the field of imaging biomarkers for spinal cord injury and cervical myelopathy. I think I got that right. Anyway, that's why I'm not quite a science journalist, but anyway, we can get past all those things. Keep it simple for people like me. So let's start with you, Jeanne, and tell us a little bit about the research that you're involved in, how federal dollars help you do that, and how that kind of thing can help the state's residents and help the state economy.
Thanks, Jeff. I'm delighted to be here today. Let me start first by noting that I began my career as a basic scientist, as a chemist, and much of my work in the research lab was supported by the National Science Foundation. This enabled us not just to push our science forward and to explore some really fundamental questions about how molecules react, but also to train students. And I feel strongly that one of the primary products that has come out of my research lab, is really the careers of the students and the postdocs that worked with me in the lab. Today, I serve as a PI on another National Science Foundation grant, which does something different. It helps us build capacity by doing research to look at how the structure of our institution supports our faculty, particularly women and faculty of underrepresented populations through the NSF Advanced program. I also serve as a co-PI on an NIH grant that gets back to one of the points Tom made earlier, that it's really important for us to work collaboratively. And this NIH program is the Clinical and Translational Science Institute of Southeast Wisconsin, which partners us. It's housed at the Medical College of Wisconsin, UW-Milwaukee, Milwaukee School of Engineering are partners, as are 3 of the hospitals and Versity, the blood center. And what this allows us to do is to help our researchers translate their research results into better health of the community. And so there is a piece of this that is, really looking at how to be better at taking research results and getting them into impacting the lives of the people in the community, as well as creating a strong and diverse talent pipeline, which has a huge economic impact on our region.
All right, well, thanks, Jeanne. Let's go to Sandra now. Sandra, UW-Milwaukee, specializing in environmental issues. Sandra, tell us a little bit about your research, how, involving federal dollars and how that helps the community, helps the economy.
Yeah, definitely. It's great to be here this afternoon. I always enjoy talking about the work we're doing. That's, I think, pretty exciting because it's really at the intersection of where the environment meets health. And my lab specifically works on identifying microorganisms like bacteria that can be used to track pollution. And microbes are really amazing kind of organisms because they can specifically sense their environment. So for example, we use organisms that are specifically adapted to humans to track sewage releases because those organisms enter our sewer system, get released into waterways. And some of our indicators that we've used for 100 years are just so general and outdated that we can only say there's fecal pollution in our waterways. We don't know if it's from agricultural runoff or from failing infrastructure or just simply from wildlife. And that has huge ramifications on what we do on management. You know, it takes millions of dollars to fix leaking pipes. We spend millions, if not tens of millions, trying to control agricultural runoff. So if we can't figure out what the worst kind of polluting source is, how can we direct resources to fixing that problem? So it all kind of comes back to needing better indicators, and microbes kind of serve that purpose. We can find very specific bacteria that is in agricultural runoff, that's in the gut of humans, and that also is in wildlife. So we do a lot of this work probably for the last 15 years around Southeast Wisconsin, but also nationally with colleagues, especially on our beach research. And that's probably the best example of where it has a really direct impact on our economy. Wisconsin's kind of tourism industry, as we know, is very robust. It's one figure I have heard, it's a $22 billion industry. And think about how many places that tourism touches water. So we have more than 180 public beaches. If we can find ways to assess water quality and make sure those beaches are clean, that really is drivers in all those small communities where those beaches are located. So our work does, you know, have kind of this very applied aspect, but it starts with a very basic research. And I think that's where the funding agencies come in. We have a diverse group of funding agencies where we get funding. NIH is our large funder for really the basic research, like what organisms should we track? What are the genetics of these organisms? And then our Wisconsin DNR gets money through the EPA to really do the more applied side. You know, what do we have to do on the management side of things? So we like to say our research kind of spans from, you know, kind of the very inception of an idea to 10 years down the road, we're actually deploying something. So in the morning, I might be sequencing DNA in the lab, and in the afternoon, we're popping manhole covers to see what's going on.
I bet you have some stories about popping the manhole covers anyway.
Yeah, a few less cell phones for sure.
Okay, so let's go to Katarina Braun. Katarina is at UW-Madison and has done extensive work in flu and COVID research. Tell us a little bit about your research. I mean, it's always on our minds, what's going on. We're entering the flu season. There's the lingering pandemic and whatnot. Tell us a little bit about your research and how the federal dollars help. Yeah,
of course. Thanks so much for having me. So viruses, and in particular RNA viruses like the COVID-19 virus, I think what the pandemic has showed us is that these viruses are going to continue to emerge from animals and cause epidemics and pandemics. So my PhD work, which was in Tom Friedrich's lab at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, worked on using the genetic fingerprint of these viruses to, like bird flu and like the COVID-19 virus, to do two things. The first was to understand how pandemic viruses emerge from animal reservoirs and adapt to human hosts. And then secondly, to try to track these viruses' movements through a human population, kind of through space and time. So as an early career researcher, I want to tell you briefly about how federal funding has helped me and people like me, and then also how I think federal dollars are being turned around and sort of put back into the Wisconsin economy. So first thing I want to say is that federal dollars are key in my role in the research that I do, but also in my research trajectory as an early career person. So in addition to the grants that are awarded to fund particular projects to principal investigators like the rest of the panelists, there are also federal mechanisms to support grants to graduate training programs and to support individual graduate students as well. So I was lucky to receive a specific fellowship through the NIH, through a federal mechanism to kind of support my specific training and my specific research. So it's the combination of these federal funds that are, I think, absolutely essential to support the recruitment and the training of future scientists. So then, briefly about the research I'm doing and how I think it's going back to Wisconsin. So what we do is to use the genetic fingerprint of the COVID-19 virus to create a virus family tree. And then we look at those trees to help us understand how that virus is getting into and then moving through a community. So early in the pandemic, we took a careful look at the viruses circulating in Dane County and then also in Milwaukee County. And I think, you know, everyone here knows that those are two very distinct but nearby and connected communities. And what we found kind of surprised us. What we found is that viruses circulating in Dane County were genetically distinct from the viruses circulating in Milwaukee. And we also found that COVID-19 was spreading differently and getting into those communities differently. So this allowed us to recommend public health interventions that were targeted to the unique dynamics of those outbreaks. And then importantly, we were also able to show that Governor Evers' safer at home order was actually effective in reducing viral spread in both of those communities. So research like this is helpful for creating and implementing evidence-based public health policies. And then I think it's sort of obvious that this work has direct and indirect implications for the Wisconsin economy. If we can limit the people infected with COVID-19, limit the number of people requiring hospitalizations, and reduce opportunities for the virus to evolve away from our immune responses, we can directly reduce the financial burden to individuals, to healthcare networks, and also to public health agencies. So these things, you know, overall, they keep people from missing work and they keep kids in school. And I think those are really positive outcomes of my work.
There's a question later on from an audience member about how did the pandemic affect your research? And I think that, so we'll come back on the pandemic. Now I want to go to Dr. Kerpot from the Medical College of Wisconsin, who specializes in spinal cord research. Welcome, Dr. Kerpot, and tell us a little bit about your research and how the federal dollars help you.
Absolutely. First of all, I'd like to thank you, Jeff, for putting this panel together this afternoon. It's a pleasure and honor to share the podium with Jeanne and Sandra and Katarina, and as well as Tom Still. We've met directly or indirectly in the past, and it's great to be in partnership with our other institutions in Wisconsin that are the recipients of federal research funding. I am originally not from Wisconsin. I just want to share some perspective. I came here 20 years ago. I was recruited here really to start a translational program in spinal cord injury research. And this involved trying to restore function to patients paralyzed from spinal cord injury and explore mechanisms to do such neural restoration. As you know, the field of stem cells was one of the fields that was born in Wisconsin. And so really this was one of the principal reasons why I came and I was recruited to Wisconsin. I often use that story to make my own recruitments as I build our department, as I build neurosciences. It is a state with a milieu for inquiry and passion and people that work hard. And I think Tom mentioned that we don't brag about ourselves enough, but I certainly think it's worthwhile doing that, because I think the environment here is absolutely something that fosters young talent like Katarina and others to grow and actually stay in the state, and which is one of the things I'm going to get to in terms of the economic benefit of federal dollars. So what I've tried to do over the last 20 years, I've been passionate about spinal cord injury research. I've tried to explore mechanisms to translate stem cells into use in patients to better their lives, and also develop imaging biomarkers, ways in which we can use MRI scanners to better predict which patients that are paralyzed are going to get useful function and which ones we have to help more in certain ways with rehab and stem cells and other types of treatments and so forth. In terms of the actual funding, I've been honored to receive now, I believe it's 5 VA merit review grants for spinal cord injury research, and a few other grants from the NIH and other large foundations that live outside of our state. And I think that the benefit of that has been to establish quite a large spinal cord injury program where we have now 4 or 5 independent researchers, each of whom has their own VA merit grants and also have NIH grants, both R01 and R21 grants in our group, as well as sort of a halo effect to encourage other people, like startup point that Tom was talking about earlier around us. This is also, we also partner with our colleague Mike McRae, who does a tremendous amount of traumatic brain injury research. We have a Center for Neurotrauma Research here. But the point of all of this is all of these research grants enable jobs. I mean, that's like one of the most critical items that I wanted to talk about. In our laboratory alone, we have more than 100 individuals, and these are extremely well-educated, talented individuals, each of whom has their own crucible of ideas, which will likely future benefit not only the state, but beyond. And we're able to fund those individuals and their families, of course, to stay here in Wisconsin and then develop their scientific careers. So that's jobs, I think, is probably the number one benefit, economic benefit of these dollars. And I'm sure my co-panelists will agree when I say that each of their programs and their institutions really have been able to create a tremendous number of jobs. The second would be recruitment. In terms of being able to recruit people from elsewhere around the state, I've learned this phrase as I do my own recruitments in the neurosciences area, that it's not really cold here. There's only such a thing as wrong clothes. And so I've learned that phrase quite well. And that, because of the impact of federal research and what we're able to attract the best and the brightest from around the country. What does that do? That not only builds their own structures of federal funding around them, but also allows the development of ideas that can be enhanced through tech transfer to create even more jobs. And then this is not in any particular order, obviously the patients, patients in Wisconsin, those that suffer from paralysis, those that suffer from a variety of other conditions, tend to benefit from the research, that they tend to directly benefit from the research, because at the end of the day, you're here to serve our community. And so that's sort of something that is a key benefit of federal dollars coming in. So I'll just stop there and then see if there's a question about that.
Well, yeah. Well, let me just ask you, Dr. Kerpot, about what I mean. Can somebody who has been paralyzed be able to use a limb again because of your research? I mean, is that the nature of it, repairing and restoring the damage to allow that kind of thing?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. So that if you think of restoring function to someone who's paralyzed, broadly, there's 2 ways to do it today, as the understanding that we have of science and of engineering. One is to regenerate or reconnect the sort of the broken portion of the spinal cord. And one can do that with a variety of medications that reduce inflammation in the spinal cord and reduce the formation of scar tissue after an injury has occurred. The spinal cord, like any other part of the body, any other tissue, tends to bruise, and that's one of the biggest enemies of regeneration and restoring function to paralyzed patients. You could also use things like stem cells to make connections. I actually participated in a national VA spinal cord injury panel where we're sort of monitoring research on the West Coast, developing new stem cell products in collaboration with Madison to sort of generate stem cells that are able to make connections where connections are broken within the spinal cord. So those would be the regenerative ways in which we can look at restoring function. Another way is to look at things like brain machine and brain computer interfaces, where we can take information from a patient's brain. In other words, I want to move this coffee cup from over there to sort of drink from it, and have a robot do that work. So effectively, to translate the electrical signals that all of us emanate from our brain when we want to perform a motor action, and have a robot do it for us. So certainly not as personally and psychologically satisfying to a paralyzed patient to have a robot do the work. Obviously people want to they want to be able to move their arms and legs themselves. So the regenerative approach is probably a more comprehensive approach. But it is possible.
Right. Okay. Well, thanks. That helps me understand it. Let's go back to Jeanne. Jeanne, I'm wondering, you've had a long career both in the research and managing pursuit of these dollars. It's like, what if the dollars weren't there? What if you had to go hunt them up from a foundation or the private sector? what would we be missing? What would research and science be missing?
Well, I think one of the things, if you go back to why the National Science Foundation was founded in the first place, really the ability to work across the translational spectrum. We've talked about translational research. You may start with some very basic science. That's hard to attract funding from corporate sponsors, for example. They're going to be more interested, and there's a place for that, to be doing that work that is of interest to developing new technologies. We certainly have a great example with our local National Science Foundation funded Center in Water Equipment and Policy that takes industry partners and allows them to help determine what kind of research is going on at UW-Milwaukee and at Marquette, and fund things that are of interest in water equipment and policy realm. But there's still, the gap would be, if we didn't have the federal agencies, that earlier stage exploratory work. When we think about the inventions that, ultimately get put into the community, or interventions, if it is a medical set of research, none of that happens without that foundational work. And that's really where the federal agencies have stepped up and allowed us to work. It also supports working in an academic environment where you're training people, you're training students at various levels and postdoctoral associates. We're not looking just for folks who are already really experienced and can walk in the door and work on it. We're also part of that talent pipeline that ultimately creates the next generation of scientists and researchers. And without federal funding, it'd be really hard to envision doing that level of training that the universities do. Right.
So, Katarina, you mentioned that, but I want to explore that a little bit more because, you're fresh from that element of your career. And, can you imagine, what that training might have been like without the federal dollars, or what some of your basic science research would have been without the federal dollars?
Yeah, it's hard to imagine because up to this point, I've solely really been supported by federal dollars. There were some dollars that came through community programs early in the pandemic because we needed money, not just we, but everyone working on COVID who transitioned their research portfolio over to COVID needed money quickly to sort of dive into those projects really fast. So I think there was money mobilized that was not federal, just because grants are slow to come by, slow to review. But other than that, all of my training, all of the support that I have currently, the majority of support in my mentor's lab and related labs are through federal dollars. So it's hard to imagine what my training could have looked like without federal support. And like Jeanne mentioned, I think, federal dollars are so important to invest in young researchers in the very beginning of training, or recruiting people to STEM fields pre-high school and earlier, and then also in college and then early grad school. There can be sort of a dichotomy between federal dollars and what they're meant to go towards. So, for example, as a graduate student, it can be challenging to find a lab that's well enough supported to guarantee your position as a graduate student for the tenure of your training, and also to support research and that you're doing as a graduate student. But it's also challenging for the PI or the leader of the lab to take on graduate students, knowing that they're going to have to turn around and provide a progress report to the federal government saying we've accomplished X, Y, and Z with these dollars, but I'm also training a graduate student who may be not as productive in their early years. So it can be challenging, I think, for especially younger labs and labs that aren't as well funded to recruit and train early investigators.
Okay, Sandra, I wanted to come to you anyway, because not everything, I think you indicated that, not everything is destined for tech transfer or practical applications. But you mentioned how you work with DNR on some of the practical applications while investigating all the some of the basic research that goes into that. And I wonder whether you could elaborate on that a little bit. And you make your point that you were going to make here, and then you can go on to what I just asked.
Yeah, great. No, I think Katarina said something really important about how, you know, the research enterprise is really set up as a training platform. All of these projects are set up as to bring in new graduate students, postdocs, and even advanced people. So imagine if we were only doing applied projects that were that immediate quick win. And I think this kind of answers your second question. You know, so many kind of problems, you want answers in a 1, 2, or 3 year time frame. But if the problems we're facing, especially in the water sector, were that easy to solve, we would have already solved them. We need really basic research that we don't really understand what's going to come out of it, but those things that started 10 or 15 years ago are the things we're drawing on to come up with those quick wins. And I think if we were only focused on the quick wins, we would miss the opportunity to really train the next generation in the really basic concepts that you need to understand in biology and physics and chemistry. And I think about my own lab, that the students that are coming through working on the basic side, where they just need to understand what DNA is and how when you extract it, what's going on chemically and the basic genetics of a microorganism, they might spend 80% of their time in the lab just learning those things, but they're the ones that are going to put 2 and 2 together and come up with the great idea in their 3rd or 4th year that I haven't thought of, because I've been thinking about it for so long and I still haven't solved that problem. And having that young talent pipeline come through with these new ideas, I think really is what makes a lab rich and very productive. That, you know, it's not just the PI as kind of a top down, here, go do this work. It's really the ideas of people that are being trained, and then they're adding solutions to whatever recalcitrant problem we're working on.
I wonder, just staying with you, Sandra, whether the pandemic will spur people to go into STEM fields. Maybe, you know, there's such a volume of things that need to be studied out of this pandemic. And I wonder whether you're, are you seeing or hearing that or thinking that?
Yeah, I think, I just was on a grant panel, and one of the grants I reviewed really made a great point where young people get engaged in research, and it's more meaningful to their education when they think they're making a difference in their community or making a difference to health. They're not just kind of studying a problem. So I do think that kind of the health crisis we've been experiencing for the last almost 2 years now really will maybe shift some people into the STEM fields, definitely.
Okay. Dr. Kerpot of Medical College of Wisconsin, I wanted to go, you talked about collaboration before, and I do think I've heard that pop up. Everybody's mentioned that. And I just wonder whether, again, whether the pandemic may have spurred more collaboration, forced collaboration, if you will. You need to unmute.
Sorry. I think as human beings, I think we're uniquely adaptable individuals, and I think because of the parameters that the pandemic put upon how we function, we found new and different ways to collaborate. Sometimes making a lot of conversations much easier than they used to be, because you no longer depend on a schedule, the weather, and a plane to get to wherever it is you're going to go, or driving somewhere, because you just, call somebody up and do what we're doing right now, and it just becomes that much more feasible. So I think overall, the pandemic has had some, although everybody's been through the ringer with the pandemic, it has had some significant beneficial effects in terms of fostering the ease of collaboration, if you will. We're able to meet new people in a different format and talk through ideas and then implement them. I also think that, one of the things that I wanted to say earlier, Jeff, was, and I think the other panelists touched on this in a variety of ways, is that, federal dollars really, they fuel the spirit of inquiry. And what that means is, for an investigator to get a federal grant, what that means is I don't have to worry about supporting my lab for the next 5 years or 3 years or something. So it gives a certain span of time where they're free to think. And what that does is it's a path to spawn off, parallel thought processes in the people that they have working with them, for themselves even, and then that leads to more federal grants, more opportunities. So it's like a mushrooming effect that that a single federal grant can lead to. So I think it's critically important to foster that. And I think Sandra might have mentioned this, that someone, it's important to fund basic research. And I'll give you one example, traumatic brain injury. And I often, my partner, Mike McRae, and I, we talk about how no one plans to get a head injury when they leave for work in the morning. It can happen to anybody, but we want to understand the processes that underlie the neurological mechanisms of traumatic brain injury and how people can recover from them. Conceptually, the idea behind traumatic brain injury was started, by a gentleman called Tom Gianrelli, who was my predecessor here 30, 40 years ago. And Mike McRae is proving those concepts now through imaging studies and biomarker studies. And so the idea of the thought that federal grant dollars are able to get people to think in new ways based on new knowledge that comes out of basic research, and that in turn generates a whole bunch of new knowledge, jobs as a result, that I think that's really important to understand, and why it's critically important to fund really basic research.
Well, people used to say, why are we going to the moon? Why are we doing that? Well, the offshoots of that are well proven now. And, and with what SpaceX and others are doing, we'll learn a lot about new things that we didn't even think of, probably, or just in terms of the mechanics of sending things into hostile territory. So back to the pandemic, though, I am curious, what happened? Did research stop? Jeanne, did research stop?
Research certainly slowed down. When we had the safer at home order for our state, we ended up having to comply with that, certainly, on our campus. And what that meant is we shut down a lot of work, had people transitioning. They were still working, but not necessarily on site. So faculty and their students and their research labs were, really forced to think about what can we do without coming into campus. We had a few folks on campus. So that slowed people down. Now we phased back up, brought people in, but it's not like flipping a light switch on, right? People came back in and you don't just pick up where you left off. You've got to get stuff started again. And so, we are still pretty much in, for many of our research community, a recovery phase, where some folks are back up and running close to where they were before, others are not. Folks who work with clinical populations, human research participants, that's been a slower journey in some ways than the basic scientists, because we also had to think about what does it mean to be out in the community or inviting the community onto campus to participate in a research study. We had clinical populations that really varied in their comfort level and their motivation for being part of a research study. So, in the last year or year and a half, some folks were very anxious to come and get back into participating in a study. Others felt that being on a university campus put them at a higher risk. And so, we really had to work around. And so it's really been a differential impact. And you layer on top of that people's personal situations, particularly for our earlier career faculty whose family situations were also disrupted, or folks who are doing caregiving at any stage of their lives. All of that factored in too. And so we're still recovering. And the last point I want to make is we also have a lot of colleagues who come from many parts of the world. And, the pathways to doing that were shut down. So we actually saw a decrease in the number of graduate students coming in some programs because they just simply were not able to get here.
Okay, well, thank you. I mean, one more thing, Jeanne. If you had a federal grant, did you get an extension on producing the product or producing the research?
Many folks have taken at least one no-cost extension. I think what we haven't seen are a lot of supplemental awards to kind of help pick back up. But people are certainly taking more time, and each agency had its own set of requirements for how you could work during this time, what was permissible to spend. Because the other thing from a workforce point of view is you didn't want to lay people off during the middle of the pandemic because of the nature of the work shifting. And so people were juggling a lot of that while we were all doing that. And certainly we were looking to see where within the institution we could provide support, but we had our own set of financial issues to be grappling with during this time. So it's been complicated.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Anybody else, stories from the pandemic? I guess, Katarina, your research might have sped up, right? Yours became a super priority, right? I mean, how did that happen given the limitations of going to a lab and the things that Jeanne talked about?
Right. I was certainly in a unique position compared to a lot of my colleagues and a lot of my co-graduate students. I just happened to be at the right place at the right time, I think, is what it came down to. I was working on avian influenza viruses and how they evolve and sequencing them prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. And a lot of people at that time thought that avian flu viruses were the most likely thing to cause a pandemic. Turns out it was a coronavirus. But so it was really easy for my lab and me in particular to transition right over to COVID-19 and kind of jump right in. So my work certainly sped up. I don't think I left the lab for like a year, but my experience was unique. And it was a real challenge for a lot of graduate students in other STEM fields, which are just as important in terms of securing funding, making sure that they were still receiving stipends and had their position secured. And we also know that the pandemic disproportionately affected women and disproportionately affected underrepresented minorities. So those are things I think about. And if I could just make one additional note on the collaboration point, you brought up earlier, one of the things that really stood out to me early in the pandemic was how important it was for academic researchers, in particular doing virus research, but generally speaking as well, to collaborate with public health officials, infectious disease doctors, policymakers, and state leadership in a way that I'd never really seen done before. We really all had to take the research that was, the sequences and the data that were coming out of basic science labs and transition that really quickly over to a public health implementation pipeline. And that there wasn't really an infrastructure or support prior to the pandemic to do that, at least formally. So it really forced our hand to work together in a way that was really powerful and I think is super important for us to continue. And what I worry is that without specific support to federal dollars to support those collaborations and to ensure that we're prepared for the next pandemic, that those collaborations will fall away again. Okay,
that would be a direct result of if you didn't have that kind of federal support, what would happen? Okay, Sandra, how did the pandemic specifically affect research at your institution?
Yeah, well, my lab's a little unique in that we jumped right into environmental surveillance. So when the pandemic emerged, it was probably January, a lot of us environmental microbiologists that actually work on wastewater and untreated sewage started communicating in exactly the way that Katarina just described it, getting together, talking about how we could use wastewater to do surveillance for COVID-19. And really by kind of putting all of our methods together, we were able to get that up and running in Wisconsin and many other states. And it really was much more difficult than if we were doing it in a normally functioning lab. Only one person could go in the lab at a time. When we would have to work out a method, it would have to be via Zoom, and that slowed the process a little bit. But it really was because of those kind of national collaborations that we had. We had networked, but we had never really collaborated before. And now there is this really strong group of environmental microbiologists that are supporting these COVID-19 surveillance programs throughout the states, and they're being handed off to public health. But it's a surveillance method that's just wasn't even in existence 18 months ago. So there's still a lot of research. There's still a lot of work to be done. And unless we solidify some of those relationships between the universities and the public health labs that will ultimately take this over, I think we're going to lose some of the ground. You know, that pandemic just really catalyzed this big push to move something forward. But we have these early adopters, but for it to become institutionalized, whether it's environmental surveillance or some of the other COVID advances we've made, for it to become institutionalized, we really need to keep those collaborations and those partnerships going.
So what did you find? What did the surveillance find? I mean, were you able to track where a certain testing wastewater from like a certain city that COVID was up or down?
Yeah, so currently in Wisconsin, our lab, along with the Wisconsin State Lab of Hygiene, we were monitoring 72 different cities. And now we now have some more sentinel sites, about 50 cities, but we can see, like, for example, the fall surge in 2020, we saw in the Green Bay wastewater system, you know, the virus increasing before the cases were actually increasing. And we saw that kind of big burst in the Green Bay area. And then we saw it a few weeks later in Milwaukee. And right now we can parallel it with, it matches up to what the percent positivity and the number of positive tests. But what's going to happen when people are tired of testing? What's going to happen? You know, we don't want to be testing endlessly for the next 10 years. So doing wastewater surveillance might be a way to track communities and see if there's a warning flag that, okay, now we got to jump back in with more public health measures or start testing again. So I think over the last year and a half, I think we've really have a good proof of concept of a way to do surveillance for this virus.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I want to go now to ask you, Dr. Kerpot, because you have your personal story and about Jeanne saying it was hard. You know, grad students from overseas weren't able to make it. And so I wonder whether this, you know, that's become kind of a political debate about having students from certain places like China, in studying in the U.S. and maybe stealing our research, and and actually Representative Gallagher, who's sponsored the Endless Frontier Act, doesn't, he very much says it's a competitive situation with China. So I guess I'm wondering though about your personal story and about, getting grad students here from overseas and, what the benefits of that are to, your institution, other institutions.
Well, it's a very, very difficult question to handle, right? Because there's a lot of potential things to consider. From my personal experience, I don't think that I'd be sitting in this chair or in this panel or have been able to do the clinical work, the surgical work, or the research work if it were not for the graduate student fellowship that I first got to come to the United States. I mean, that is the cornerstone of my entire career for the last 30 years. And it has been, without it, there's no possibility that I would have ever been able to afford to come to the United States. So I think, speaking from that perspective, I think the vast majority of students are students globally. They have the same spirit of scientific inquiry. They have the same spirit of wanting to contribute to the world of science, to the growth of knowledge. And I think, just speaking again from personal experience, I think people who come to this country, which is, in my opinion, the most unique nation in the world, having lived and grown up in India and, gone with my parents to England, lived in Stockholm, Sweden for a while, there is no other place like the United States. And this is from direct personal experience. And so I think that, being able to maintain a funding stream and maintain a mechanism in which we encourage students from all over the world to come here and do research and grow their careers, I think is going to be fundamental to our success as a state and as a country. I think it's really, really important to figure out ways to make that process more effective and make it more efficient, but figure out a way to not just preserve the process, but also grow it in a substantial way. So that's sort of my overall view of the situation. Right,
because, well, you came here and stayed and, built a life and built a research inventory. So I think what you're saying is your experience can be replicated, through having graduate students from overseas come here.
Right, and I think that it adds an element of competitiveness, which makes us better. It adds an element of diversity, an element of perspective, all of which only make us better. And the track record of this country excelling in those areas, other than over any other country in the world, is because of that permissive environment. I think it's an absolute essential to our success as not only a state, but as a country.
Okay, so I'm going to have, here's an audience question. I'm going to direct this at Jeanne because you're more in the, maybe in the administrative mode. This person says, without a specific example, why hasn't the success with federal funding been translated into better success into business-sponsored research? I think Tom still talked about how the university research is often leveraged into, but maybe this question is different in the sense that, do you see more collaboration, but not just within university research, but with somebody, I don't know, a GE Healthcare who could, explore something?
Yeah, I think there are some cultural differences between how a corporate sponsor wishes to see research done and how university faculty are trained to do research. There's often some navigating of that. Having said that, our federal agencies have actually put us in a stronger position to do more of this. The National Science Foundation, through the Industry University Cooperative Research Center model, has put on the table opportunities in a variety of fields. We happen to have one water equipment policy right here in Milwaukee. But one of the things that they did that was very smart early on is they understood that the tech transfer questions had to be taken off the table. So they set up the policy about how the corporate partners in these centers would be able to negotiate for intellectual property that comes out of the research that they're supporting. And so it didn't become a conversation every time between the universities and the companies. Everybody played by the rules that NSF had established. So I think that was a positive thing. As we do more of this, I think there will be more success in it. One of the things we've seen in some Department of Energy awards that these are for larger scale projects. They may be led by a university, but there are often corporate partners involved in them. We've seen a couple of these in the development of things like better electric cars that's going on our campus, where GM is a partner with universities, with a national lab. And so, really thinking more broadly about how do you bring larger groups together that will have the expertise and the perspectives that the universities can offer, as well as the companies and their expertise and their drive to see the stuff get commercialized.
But that's interesting that you mentioned that because the National Science Foundation laid the guidelines out, that helped foster, help make it easier. Okay, here's a question that is for Sandra. Somebody wants to know regarding Wisconsin's water supply, what are the contaminants that are the new contaminants that are of most concern, and what should we all be doing to keep our water supply safe? That's pretty broad, but maybe you can talk about, from your experience, the things that really trouble you, and some research into those elements.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and we could spend an hour on it. I think we have shifted from really acute concerns like waterborne disease, is our water clean, to the more chronic concerns, are there low levels of contaminants that will hurt us chronically? And those are the things that are the black box right now, where we don't really know their effects. Because they're at low levels, it's really hard to experimentally show an effect. You can ramp up the dose of, let's say, some of the emerging contaminants that maybe are new chemicals that we're just manufacturing now. It's hard to do toxicology tests to say, if you put them in the environment, they don't break down easily, what's going to happen in 20 years if we're constantly exposed to that. I think one of the key things in keeping our water safe, though, is our engineering controls. And I think keeping those engineering controls up to date is really important. For example, wastewater treatment, a lot of the water we drink that goes through our pipes gets treated and it's released into waterways that eventually is used again as a drinking water source. And that cycle of water, we're really fortunate here on Lake Michigan because we're drawing from one of the cleanest bodies of water, but it still has a 100-year residence time. Eventually, if we put enough chemicals in, we are drinking what we put in Lake Michigan. Cities on rivers or on smaller reservoirs, that cycle is much shorter. So I think if we can invest more into understanding how we can do better treatment, we can take some of these emerging contaminants out of the cycle. And then the other part of this that we have to keep up on, and I think it's behind the research, is we're understanding the effects, but I think the policy end kind of lags behind. When we look at how we regulate our water, some of these emerging contaminants aren't even on the table. And I'll use one I'm more familiar with, antibiotic resistance in bacteria. We're taking more and more antibiotics. The bacteria that we shed that goes through these systems, more and more are carrying some of these dangerous antibiotic resistance elements. And we don't really know what the cycle of how they come back into the population. But yet the wastewater treatment plants are not even close to discussing regulations on those types of things. So I think we need a balance of research of identifying the strongest problem, but side by side, kind of that balanced policy of, can we identify the worst one and maybe have some policies to make sure those chemicals are either treated or removed. That
sounds like a research grant application. Okay, yeah. So we're running out of time here, and like you said, Sandra, we could talk about these issues are fascinating. I mean, this basic research that's right before us and that is resulting in all sorts of medical, health, and engineering gains. I mean, we're in a fascinating time, and I think the pandemic, seems to have spurred on. If we look at the silver lining part of it, it's spurred on some things that we can really a foundation for the future. But I wanted to ask you here, we're talking about these federal research dollars, and more money seems like an obvious answer. But what other tools or what other things can the feds do or governments do to help you? What's missing? It's like, wow, if we had this, then things would really happen in my research field. Why don't we just start with you, Dr. Kerpot?
I think one of the things that would pertain to my field as it relates to neural regeneration, whether it's for spinal cord injury patients, whether it's for patients with multiple sclerosis or Parkinson's, a variety of other conditions, I think we have a very effective process from a regulatory perspective, but streamlining that process to afford new technologies and new ideas to be developed into active treatments for patients would be extremely beneficial, because it's somewhat variable and it can be a significant issue in terms of being able to get approval to test new treatments in patients. But I think while keeping a very firm eye on the safety of the process, which is very well done right now, I think to have a streamlined way in which we can get new ideas to translate to new treatments for patients would be a very useful thing that the feds could do.
Well, wouldn't the pandemic have set an example of how that could be done? The emergency authorizations for X vaccine or?
That's exactly
why
right.
pill?
That's exactly right. You took the words almost right out of my mouth, Jeff. And I think it's, as Katarina said, I think, you know, this is a crisis from which a lot of learning has happened over a very short time. Ordinarily, all of the things that have happened from a collaboration from a federal level to a research scientist level would have taken probably years, if not decades. And I think this has afforded us a blueprint, if you will, of ways in which we might use our newly developed processes and see how else we can apply it.
Okay, let's go to Katarina. You know, like other than more money, you know, which is, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I mean, beyond that, it's like, what do you think is missing? What tools would you like say, wow, I could really use this?
I think one of the things the pandemic highlighted, going back to the collaboration I brought up before between infectious disease researchers and then public health agencies is support and mechanisms and outlines in terms of how researchers can share data. So how we can upload data quickly to repositories that can be used not just by us, but by public health agencies, by policymakers. So guidelines and infrastructure to upload and distribute data seem really important to me, and something that doesn't currently exist in a good enough form, I guess. And then the other thing briefly, I think as a early career investigator, that's so important is strong mentorship programs. So in addition to just money, being paired and mentored with people who have walked the path that I am hoping to walk, and so that they can impart their wisdom on me and sort of be there to coach me along the way. There are some structures like that, but I think more formal mentorship programs, especially focused on women and underrepresented minorities, are really critical to producing a diverse and strong STEM workforce.
Yeah, great. All right, Sandra, what's the missing tool, or the tools, couple tools that you would really like to have beyond, like, yeah, more federal dollars? But I mean,
you know, well, and this one is tied a bit to dollars, but maybe it's more of a policy aspect. I would say more basic traineeships for students and postdocs that are maybe not earmarked for a lab, but take really influx more talented people into the research labs. Because I think when I think about what the limiting factor is in my research, I might have the federal dollars, but I don't have access to the students. Maybe I can't commit to them for 5 years to finish their PhD. I can't offer stability. And I think that goes also for, there are great tools out there, but sometimes we don't have the time or the energy to get trained on them. So a great example is what happened during the pandemic with all the sequencing information on COVID. There's great bioinformatic pipelines to analyze that data and really get more information out of these data sets, but not a lot of PIs or researchers are trained on those. So having more of a, and maybe mentorship falls into it too, but having more of a focus on the training and talent development pipeline, as opposed to just research dollars to get a research project done. Right.
Okay, that's very interesting. Invest in the human capital. Okay, Jeanne, you've got the last word here. What kind of tools? What other tools could federal and state governments give you to help your operation work better?
Well, I'm actually going to build on what I just heard here from everybody. Really, what we have is our people. We have technologies, but it's the people that drive this work. And I think a tool that personally I would like to see in the level I'm at would be something that would allow us to take researchers at all stages of their career and provide them with the opportunity to shift what they're doing. Because the world is changing rapidly. We saw a great example with the COVID research that people had to jump on research projects that were defined to meet that emerging need. I think we have a lot of talent and a lot of capacity that's not necessarily well leveraged if people would just keep working in the stream that they're in. And so for researchers at all levels to be able to have what is a luxury in some cases, Sandra just noted, it's hard for a PI to necessarily get quickly retrained on something. but to give people that opportunity to shift and to leverage, we talked a lot about collaboration. It takes time to build those partnerships and relationships. And so it's a gift of time and, some space to explore the new frontiers.
Yeah. Well said, everybody. I mean, it's enjoyed, meeting you online and talking about these things and talking about your goals for further research. I mean, it's obviously the federal dollars are obviously huge for your institutions. And it sounds like some people in Congress recognize the importance and want to provide more. So we'll have to keep track of that. I hope we can convene at a later date sometime, but that's going to wrap it up for today. I want to thank Jeanne Hossenlopp from Marquette University, Dr. Kerpot from the Medical College of Wisconsin, Sandra McLellan, from UW-Milwaukee, and Katarina Braun from UW-Madison. I also want to thank Tom Still from the Wisconsin Technology Council and the Wisconsin Technology in general for helping in this field, in this effort. And if you can just go to the website, Wisconsin Technology Council website, and find out more and contact Tom that way. Also, thanks to all the people from Marquette and UW-Madison and UW-Milwaukee and the Medical College who helped recruit these great panelists and help put this program together. So this is Jeff Mayers signing off now for today, and we'll be back soon. You can look for our programs at wispolitics.com and at wisbusiness.com. Thanks very much for tuning in.